Hey everyone, it's Pajamas, and in this video I decided to put Raspberry Pi OS on a gaming laptop. And for those of you that aren't that familiar, Raspberry Pi OS is a Linux-based and specifically a Debian-based operating system designed for Raspberry Pis first and foremost, but it's also usable on a lot of older or low-end hardware and laptops, computers, and things like that. So installing it on a gaming PC or gaming laptop might seem a little bit overkill, mainly because it is. Uh, but I was curious and I wanted to see how Raspberry Pi would do on my laptop. And spoilers, it wasn't the greatest. So for those of you that are curious, I have used Linux in the past. First Ubuntu and then Linux Mint. I know those are very beginner distros, but I have to start somewhere, okay? And I kind of want to get away from Windows bloat and spyware stuff and also experiment with some other operating systems. So I tried these out and they were kind of a disaster. First thing I noticed was the terminal, which actually wasn't too bad. In fact, if you wanted to get software on Linux, most reliable way to do it, as all you have to do is find the correct command and then either type it in or copy paste it, and boom, software. Compare that with Linux packages, which they never seem to work out for me. I'd click on it and it should run like a Microsoft installer, but they just never did. One of the issues I had with Linux was the fact that I was running it on a laptop, which for me at least, laptops and Linux do not mix. When you turn off the laptop, what would happen is your fans would run at full blast, your CPU and GPU would run at full blast, your battery's draining the entire time, and the only way to keep it from like cooking itself was essentially to either power cycle it with a power button, which isn't the best for the computer, to put it in suspend mode on Linux, which is kind of like hibernate or sleep mode on Windows. Or if you're in a dual boot mode, what you could do is boot into Windows and then shut down, and that would properly turn the computer off. None of these were really that preferable, but hey, they worked. What didn't work, however, was the Nvidia GPU, which yeah, Nvidia GPU and Linux also don't mix, and a lot of people can vouch for this. I could tell you. Um, so for those of you that don't know, there are two types of drivers for Linux for Nvidia, and that is the open source or Nouveau drivers and the proprietary drivers. And the Nouveau drivers are pretty good for everyday use if you like browsing the web and watching videos. But if you have a GPU and you use it for GPU things like gaming or intensive software, they either run really poorly or not at all. Whereas the proprietary drivers, they're kind of buggy and they're kind of old and they're not open source. But if you want performance, you get performance from those if you could get it to install. Now, the issue I had was that I tried to go through the GUI driver interface and install my proprietary drivers, and it wouldn't install, or at least it wouldn't tell me that it installed correctly. So I tried to install the proprietary drivers manually, and that would always end up killing my system and my run with Linux. In fact, kind of the reason why I want to start Linux again is I wanted to see if I could get those dang pesky proprietary drivers working. As far as Linux installations go, Raspberry Pi OS was pretty routine. All you do is get the ISO image of your operating system, get a program like Rufus to write the installer and operating system onto a flash drive, and then boot into your flash drive from your BIOS so that you can run the installer. There are a few things that tripped me up, such as the live CD not going into the operating system and Bluetooth and Wi Fi not working. And also, the Ethernet drivers confused me because my computer doesn't have Ethernet, at least not in a typical sense. But apart from that, the install went pretty smoothly, and if I were to do it again, it'd be really quick to reinstall Linux on my computer. Raspberry Pi also has some imagers, which lets you plug in an SD card and then image the operating system directly onto the SD card, but it wouldn't really work for my use case, so I end up going with the installer instead. The imager also had some pretty neat options, but that's kind of outside the scope of this video. Other, we can install Ubuntu through this. Okay, so we could just straight up install Ubuntu. Well, at least there's an option where you could just pick what you want. Interesting too. I've always been interested about RetroPie and I think Laka. No idea what Recalbox is. Paid OS. 3D Printer OS. Okay, we're digging down a big rabbit hole. What we're trying to do is install Raspberry Pi Desktop OS. That's all we're trying to do. I promise. So unfortunately, the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth issue came back to haunt me later. The drivers weren't installed out of the box, and I tried a couple of guides to install drivers manually, none of which worked. Um, I couldn't tell if it was the Ethernet drivers from earlier or if my drivers just weren't ready for the kernel or what. In fact, I even tried tethering my phone via USB, and that didn't really work either, not at first. I guess what ended up happening is one of my USBs wasn't actually recognized as a USB, but the other one was. So I was eventually able to get my phone tethered and give me Wi-Fi in that way. The next thing I tried to do was install those pesky proprietary Nvidia drivers, and fortunately they won again. They ended up killing my system again, where I couldn't really do anything. There was no GUI and I couldn't type in anything. So I ended up having to reinstall Raspberry Pi OS again. And what's even funnier is while I was trying to get everything in order, the Windows BitLocker decided to start biting at me too, which was just a huge demo whammy. Well, fun little update, and I say fun because you remember this guy here, right? The thing that I needed in order to do the fun mode on my computer. Well, I re-enabled it so I could get in because Windows was telling me no logging in computer unless you have safe mode on. The thing is, when I do that, oh wait, is it gonna boot back in? Okay, never mind. It was telling me that I need the BitLocker thing, and I'm probably gonna disable that because I don't care about no security. Let me access my computer first. But it was weird because I turned it on and it still wouldn't let me like log in, so I don't know what the deal there was. I also had issues with OBS as well, and I had to get it running eventually, lest I use only phone footage. And I ran into a couple of weird issues too, such as window boxes stretching all the way across the screen, not displaying any text, and not getting any text on any of the text boxes either, which made it really hard to tell what did what. Um, and at one point, even the whole window disappeared, and it refused to show up until I made the fix of resetting my GUI for my desktop, which made some things harder to read, but at least it allowed OBS to work properly. I also had some issues with my mic and speakers. Speakers were really tinny, and I suspected that the driver servos weren't properly installed. This is an issue that's specific to Debian or Raspberry Pi, as Ubuntu kind of has this issue with my specific computer as well. I tried using my mic from my headphones, however, and those didn't work. And the issue is using the onboard mic had a lot of fans in it. Fortunately, I don't think you guys will have to hear a whole lot of it, but I did end up turning a filter and it helped somewhat, but it had some weird artifacts in sound as well. Maybe you'll hear it if I leave in a clip. So, let's see how the games go. We'll start with code the classics. I have to code my own game. So every version of Linux has a software store. Ubuntu has a Snap store. Linux Mint and Debian have their own stores. And Raspberry Pi OS technically has a software store, but it was all programming languages and projects and things like that. They didn't even have basic stuff like OBS and Steam. So as far as I was concerned, if I wanted to get a software, I'd have to look it up online. Fortunately, I didn't have the issue of the computer cooking itself to death in its sleep with Raspberry Pi OS, but that didn't mean that it didn't have its fair share of battery and performance issues. For example, on Windows, I get around 10 hours of battery life on idle or more, and if I'm doing something light, I could get about 5 hours. And if I decide to game, I get about 2 or 3 hours. And using OBS practically doesn't affect this at all because there's no CPU usage and pretty much everything is offloaded to the Nvidia GPU. But even in software encoding, it uses absolutely nothing to run OBS. Compare that with Linux, where just idling will only get me 3 hours of battery life. And if I do anything, such as opening a browser or open OBS and not record anything, my battery life immediately cuts down to 1 hour. Not to mention, the computer ran super hot the minute I did decide to do anything, whether it was test out some of the games that were pre-installed as programming projects. Um, that just cooked my system alive, just running OBS and a very light game. And as you're about to see, that doesn't get any better with any real games. No, the cool thing about Linux is that a lot of games that run well on Windows will also run really well on Linux. In fact, about a third of my library is able to run natively on Linux, and pretty much every game except for one in my Steam library is confirmed to run through Steam Proton, which is Steam's version of Wine. Unfortunately, that wouldn't do me much good, as you're about to see. Counter-Strike Source was the first game that I tried out, and already we were sub 30 FPS throughout the whole thing. There's lots of jittering and stuttering going on, and it just wasn't that playable, but it was still fun at least, as you'll see. I don't. Okay. I guess I'm just. I guess I'm running this with just a pistol. Oh god, it's stuttering. Two to go. Yep. Ow. The lag spikes literally hurt. And my team carried the game, so that's cool. Oh god, this is so stuttery. Literally And before it comes to like, which one's more painful? The frame rate or this guy's playing? Threaten the actual... I'm going to rewatch that. I'm going to rewatch that, because there was... Okay, to be fair, that wasn't a human player, so I can't say hacks. Literally aimbot, though. Borderlands 2, on the other hand, was single-digit slideshow throughout the menu, and it only got worse as we went into the other menus and eventually into the game. Just completely unplayable. And this would be a running theme with all the other games I tried, as everything else either didn't run or ran similarly slowly in this single-digit FPS range. And I couldn't tell what was going on. So I have a few theories on why games weren't running that well on Raspberry Pi OS, but first let me give a little bit of background. So for reference, I'm using Asus G14 4060 2023 model, which includes a rather beefy 780M iGPU from AMD. That alone should be able to run any of the games in my library, and using the 4060 should be no problem at all for any of the games. So the fact that even something like Counter-Strike Source was having issues must mean that neither GPU is being utilized that well. Now, for reference, Windows is pretty good at recognizing GPUs and using them. In fact, if you have a switchable graphics setup like mine, where you have integrated and dedicated graphics, it can use both at the same time, kinda. So different tasks get offloaded to different CPUs, like dedicated graphics might take care of the game or into the software that you're using, it might take care of recording or streaming. And then your integrated graphics could also take care of streaming or recording, as well as taking care of light stuff like browsing and then pushing the frames from your dedicated graphics onto your screen, which also saves battery power. At some slight performance, that's not the point. The point is it can use both GPUs. Linux, on the other hand, doesn't have that, especially not out of the box unless you're using something with really good hardware support like Pop! OS. Typically what happens is by default it wants to use only one GPU and the other one just gets shut down. You can install some programs or software to get switchable graphics to work, but I'm not sure if I ever got mine working because I couldn't tell what was being used at the time. And in any case, games can pick which graphics they want to use, if any at all. One of my theories is that the games were running completely in software, as in neither GPU were being used uh, to run the game. Everything was being run through the CPU alone. And that would explain why we had bad performance in games. But another thing is, I have a feeling the Nouveau drivers could have also been a culprit, as those are also known for having very poor performance in games. And as a result, they also, since Linux only likes to use one GPU at a time, uh, the AMD drivers or graphics would be sidelined. In either case, the Nvidia proprietary drivers would be a lot better as they would give you better performance, and also they support switchable graphics from the get-go if they work. Now, as you know, the proprietaries didn't work, and that includes when I tried reinstalling them. It once again killed my computer, and I think I know why. So I saw a fix specifically for Raspberry Pi OS, since I was using Debian guides at the time, and they weren't always reliable. Um, but I looked at the Raspberry Pi guide to installing Nvidia drivers. I know that's not usually a use case, but luckily they were there. Um, and I find out that the Raspberry Pi desktop environment isn't really compatible with the Nvidia proprietary drivers. Something about 32-bit desktop environments not supporting it. But a possible solution would be to install any other desktop environment, such as GNOME, KDE, or I was considering Cinnamon since it kind of has a mix of both worlds. It's super lightweight, but it's like Windows. But I consider that cheating because we want to run a Raspberry Pi OS, not a weird version of Debian that has Cinnamon. So that's not in the scope of this video, but um, it's not off the table yet. I'm not calling it quits just yet. I may make another video where I actually try out the AMD drivers because I never really considered the AMD drivers. I was kind of too busy trying to get the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and then later on the Nvidia GPU to work correctly, among other things. And I never considered AMD graphics drivers, so I may give that a shot. And barring that, I may run Cinnamon in order to get the proprietary drivers to work. But that's for another video. Right now, I'm considering this run of Raspberry Pi to be on hold. So I still haven't installed my computer, but it's dead. I'm gonna have to reinstall it. So, should you use Raspberry Pi OS for your computer? Probably not. I definitely recommend something like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Pop! OS, Manjaro, even Debian. I know Raspberry Pi OS is basically Debian, but it's weird because it doesn't have stuff that Debian normally has, like its own software store. And even some stuff that would normally work well in Debian, like some of the guides that I use, didn't work here. Like for example, sudo apt doesn't always work, and trying to add repositories didn't really work the way suggested in the guides. So this is really a weird version of Debian that can't really do everything that even Debian can. So it is really limited in what you could do with it. But if you have really low end hardware and you nothing else has worked so far, or you can get it to work, maybe give it a shot because it's probably going to be pretty similar to something like Debian, just a bit more limited. But if you have any sort of decent modern hardware, I would go with something else. But yeah, that's going to be it for this video. Um, if you have any comments, such as things I should do next, things I did wrong and should fix for next time, let me know. And until then, I'm going to disappear into the void for another 6 months or so.